Hello and welcome to Roundtable. Today we're joined by Sanjay Baru, who's out with his new book. It's a book on India's power elite called Class, Caste and a Cultural Revolution. It is a study on the nature of power and elitism in post-colonial India. As you know, Sanjay is an academic who turned to journalism. He's a former editor of Economic Times, Business Standard, Financial Express, but also he's been the media advisor with Prime Minister Manmohan Singh. And his earlier book, Accidental Prime Minister, made a lot of waves. And actually last month during a roundtable, in fact, when we broke the news of Sanjay's new book, another Sanjay Jha had said, I hope this book is not an accidental one. I don't think this is an accidental one. Is it, Sanjay? Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Yeah, certainly not accidental. In fact, as I mentioned in the very introduction, it's a book that's been in my mind for some time. I've been wanting to write it. Fortunately, thanks to lockdown, when I was confined to my house for almost 3-4 months without going out, I found the time to sit down and write it.
But, it's very interesting, Sanjay. In this book, you actually trace, what we would call the concept, how power and the elitism, rather, is linked to political parties, obviously. So there was the Nehruvian elitism, which, changed over time, not much during Vajpayee's time, but now there is, of course, a new intelligentsia of Modi. Can you just explain this a bit more broadly for our viewers?
Yeah, you see, my point is that even at the time of independence, unlike in the case of, let's say, Russia, which had a revolution in 1917, or China that had a revolution in 1949, or many other post-colonial countries that had major social upheavals, India, the transition was very smooth. So the same people who were, constituted the power elite before independence remained the power elite afterwards. I mean, look at business. G.D. Birla was already a big businessman during British period, and after independence became even a bigger businessman. Similarly, the institution of the ICS officers, they were a legacy of the British Empire, but they continued after independence. So many institutions continued. So the transition in India allowed a pre-existing elite and even feudal, for example, the Madhurao Scindia, the Gwalior family, Vijayaraja Scindia, Madhurao Scindia, they were all very powerful kings and queens before independence. And they continued into politics and acquired power after independence. So that elite, there's a long period of continuity. And the point I make in this book is that when the Congress declined, and the Congress decline, of course, began almost in the 80s, and the BJP came into power, the BJP slowly acquired the same elite. So when Atal Bihari Vajpayee was Prime Minister, his principal secretary, who was the most powerful officer in the PMO and the government at that time, Brajesh Mishra, was the son of a congressman. He was a former foreign service officer. And, the same elite that was there in power earlier continued in power. Or you take a man like N.K. Singh, and I refer to N.K. Singh in my book. He was very close to Pranab Mukherjee. He was very close to the Congress regime. And then he became very close to Vajpayee. So there was a certain continuity. And very interestingly, some people in the BJP began to criticize Vajpayee. I refer to a column by Swapan Das Gupta where he says to Vajpayee, get your own elite. Why are you using Congress elite? We should have our own elite. And I think that's what Modi has done. Modi is now trying to bring in his own elite, if you like. And it's a very different class. It's a very different social class. First of all, it's not a very English-speaking class, though you still have people like Swapan Das Gupta, is Oxford-educated, Englishman, very much an Englishman. But most of them are not. They're very vernacular.
Which is what you actually mentioned, the intelligentsia around Modi or even Amit Shah and Yogi is what you said. They are, more, they think in Hindi, dream in Hindi, communicate in Hindi. And very interestingly, as you said, they are not the types who don't eat with a knife and fork. They are very comfortable and confident about the fact that they don't know how to use a knife and fork. They're not diffident, which is what used to be earlier. Correct. The markers are different.
The markers are different. And I think that's an important social transition. I mention it as an example, as a metaphor. But it's so different today when you see these young people. They are no longer diffident as their earlier generation used to be about not being either. For example, you take something like English. Today you have a lot of young people who don't know very good English, but don't care. They speak tutta putta English. And multinationals have come to terms with it. I mentioned, for example, the Pepsi ad, Ye Dil Mange More, where a multinational soft drink company uses a Hindi, slogan written with English letters, Ye Dil Mange More, to sell a Pepsi. And I think that is the kind of change that is happening, where we are comfortable in our kind of mixed identity, not apologetic about bad English. People no longer laugh if we don't speak proper English, stuff like that.
I think today's power symbol is the Gujarati number plate. I was noticing.
And eating dhokla.
And eating dhokla. And before we talk about the political part, the PMO, which you've seen really from the inside also, you also mentioned how bureaucracy and PMO really where bureaucracy is at its sharpest, is most powerful, is, it was first to the Tamram during, I think, Nehru's time, then it became Sanjay Gandhi brought in the Punjabis, and then Manmohan Singh, I think, went back to the Brahmins. And of course, now we have the Gujarati lobby in Modi's PMO.
Yes, very much so. I mean, I think provincialization of the Prime Minister's office is not new. Yeah, it is not new. It happened. Indira Gandhi had Kashmiris all around her, PN Aksar, PN Dar, and Rajiv Gandhi had a lot of Punjabis, Gopi Arora, Suman Dubey, the lady Grover, I think, the lady IAS, Sarla Grover. So, the influx of Punjabis in the 1980s into the PMO. Then Manmohan Singh had both Punjabis and Malayalis, T.K. Nair, M.K. Narayanan, Shiv Shankar Menon. And of course, now with Mr. Modi, it's either Gujaratis or Gujarat cadre, So that kind of a thing has been there for a long time. But I think the difference I'm drawing to is the earlier civil service in this country, particularly the ICS, but also the early IAS. I mean, my own father was a 1950 IAS officer. That generation of IAS, they were much more, Western in their thinking in terms of practices. I mean, they believed in parliamentary democracy. They believed in constitutional values. They believed in the rule of law. But today you have a lot of, officers in the IAS, in the IPS, etc., who are less and less committed to these values.
Also, what is interesting, you mentioned, N.K. Singh, for instance, but, the earlier values. He's the consummate, I think, bureaucrat, but he made his way from the Congress establishment to Vajpayee very smoothly, but he's not been able to do that with the Modi's establishment.
Well, I mean, I mentioned N.K. as an example. Like that, my book is full of some examples. I don't
What makes it interesting, I want...
Yeah, that's right. So I brought in some examples. N.K. certainly is a bureaucrat, who is very powerful. He, in fact, was responsible for the retirement age for the IAS being increased from 58 to 60 just in time for his own retirement to be extended. But also someone who moved from one regime to another very smoothly. And he has not suffered. I mean, he has benefited from even Modi with a cabinet rank position as chairman of the Finance Commission. But I mentioned that as an exception. That the rule now is that you have a whole lot of new officers who are who come from very different institutions. Many of them have an engineering background. They come from Raipur or Indore. That not from Bombay, Delhi, Madras. That's the kind of change.
Yeah, that's the thing. The old markers have changed early, or the old network has changed. Early on, you knew that everybody, depending on what political establishment, was either from Doon, Stephens, or that had Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard pedigree attached to them. Whether Montague would replace an NK, and Romila and Montague would differ, but they would be part of the same intelligentsia, so as to speak. Today's intelligentsia has a whole lot of different markers, and new names have come up. For instance, you give very interesting examples, say where a seminar has been replaced by a Swarajya, where a Gymkhana club gathering may be replaced by India Foundation meet, that kind of a thing.
Yes.
So that's also
right.
a change.
That's right. I think the seminal idea in the Swapan Das Gupta column, which I quote, which he wrote when Vajpayee was Prime Minister. And that very interesting term he used. He said, you should get your own elite. And that's what Modi is trying to do or has done. He's bringing in his own elite. So, in various institutions, you see, I give the example of the Jawaharlal Nehru University or Nehru Memorial Museum, but we see it happening in many other institutions where the old elite is being replaced by new elite. Incidentally, many of them are also Oxbridge types, but more and more very desi in terms of their social background.
Yeah, Oxbridge is not a badge of honor. In today's world, is something you hide and you bring out your Kendriya Vidyalaya education more.
Right. That's right. That's right. Yes.
So that is the change. But also you talk about the whole role of neo-nationalism, and that, a bit about how it's even in the military, we always had it, but now because of the narrative of nationalism or the politicization of the military, or you talk about how it's affected various wings, not just the bureaucracy also. I'll talk about the media after this, in fact.
Yes, I think that is a very disturbing change that we see. For example, the armed forces or the police forces, the complete politicization of these institutions. I mean, I give examples. I mean, General V.K. Singh is a stark example of an army chief who's become a minister and talks like a politician. But there are others, and I think police we have seen for a long time across the country in different states, where senior police officers have become nothing but instruments of local politicians and are cutting across political parties. So there is a certain weakening of institutions, and that is something many people have commented on. But what I'm focusing on is how this has affected the composition of the elite. That for example, I begin with the example of my own grandfather who was in the ICS, and when he passed away, his college wrote an obituary drawing attention to the fact that not that he was a great officer, but that he was a student of C.V. Raman. They took pride in his intellectual capabilities, right? That he was a physicist, who was a student of C.V. Raman. So the ICS and the IAS were seen as a meritocracy. The merit was the most important qualification. Today, that's no longer the value. I mean, you're no longer valuing merit. It's about connections. It's about caste. Cadre, which state do you come from? Which caste do you belong to? So there is a loss of that element of merit being the defining element of the civil services, and I think that weakens the position of the bureaucracy within the power elite. One of the points I make in my book, Priya, is how important the bureaucracy is to the Indian power elite, unlike in the case of the US, where there is no permanent bureaucracy. But here there is a permanent bureaucracy, but its own identity is getting diluted.
Wasn't that always the case? There are a few exceptions, of course, but every political establishment brought in its own. So there again, it's who you are comfortable with, rather than merit that got you jobs. With
it was not always the case. No, it was not always the case. Let me give you two examples. The practice till the 80s was that if you could not become a finance secretary, Government of India, unless you had a background in finance. First of all, you would have had to serve within the finance ministry at lower levels, under secretary, joint secretary. You would have had to have some experience at the state level, and then only you could aspire for the top job. Same thing in defense. You could not become defense secretary unless you had worked in the ministry at lower levels. That practice is given up. Today, you can get these jobs if the Prime Minister likes you. Not just today. It started this practice started in the even with Rajiv Gandhi. You could get people being appointed to important positions merely because the Prime Minister or his wife liked you, and that has continued. So today yeah, exactly. And today you have a lot of people in positions of power with very little experience in their relevant spheres of activity.
How do you see this affecting the media, Sanjay? You talk about it in your book, of course, where media has political favorites, or political favorites has media favorites, rather.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I begin with the high point for the media in the 90s with a story where, Samir Jain, who was the vice chairman of the Times Group, was once asked, is the Times of India pro-establishment or anti-establishment? And Samir Jain said, we are neither pro-establishment nor anti-establishment, but we are establishment. So that was a kind of self-confidence of the Times Group that we represent the establishment. We also had this example of Ramnath Goenka, who took on Indira Gandhi during the emergency. The Indian Express refused to kowtow to censorship. Though at the same time, during the emergency, we had the example today, which was actually launched as a magazine to defend the emergency. And Arun Puri's opening issue of the India Today wrote editorial justifying the emergency and praising Indira Gandhi. So we had this kind of a media that was kowtowing to people in power, but by and large, there was a certain level of independence and autonomy, and media took great pride in that. What is the situation today? Today, a large number of us believe, those of us who've been in the media, who are dealing with the media, that media has become increasingly partisan. People get identified, oh, you're pro-government, anti-government. There's a certain loss of morale within the media because of this, because of increasing, from the social media. You're abused, trolled in social media and abused by people belonging to either side. I mean, it's not just one political party. There are trolls in the Congress, there are trolls in the BJP. So there is a certain loss of morale within the organized media, and editorial control has also weakened. I mean, with the institution of the editor having become a weaker institution. So the point I'm making, of course, in my book is that the media in many countries was certainly a member of the power elite, but the position of the media, like the bureaucracy, has weakened as political leaderships have become strong.
But again, is this something that is the role of social media cannot be ruled out? But this was also something that was happening over time. You yourself mentioned Prannoy Roy, how he was very close to the Congress, and now there is, of course, an Arnab Goswami, etc., who are close to the BJP. So this is something we've seen over time. It's more in your face right now, but that's about it. The degrees has changed.
It is certainly more in your face, but also there is a difference in the sense that you could live and let live. Private sector was not afraid of advertising in newspapers that were critical of the government. Today, your private sector is afraid of funding websites or newspapers or TV channels that are critical of the government. That fear has come back. That was there during the emergency. That fear has come back. So you'll see a businessman saying, sorry, we don't want to fund you or advertise in your publication or TV channel or website because you're seen as being critical of the government. That is a change.
The business also, in fact, you talk about the business class also, how that is coming in more and more today than earlier.
That's right. That's right.
That. But again, to come back a little bit on the media part, I still, would like to say that, there is, now you actually, this whole narrative of nationalism or, the role of nationalism in this whole elite is an argument also. The more nationalistic you are, the more elite you become, the more in favor you are with the government. That narrative also is taken up. You talk about it towards the end.
That's true, but I make a distinction. I mean, nationalism was always important in this country. After all, we as a nation are the product of a national movement. And the elite were very proud of this fact that we fought the British, we fought against colonialism and established a democracy. But I think what is happening today is we are defining that nationalism in narrower terms. And that is why, the phrase Hindu nationalism has come to be used. That we are defining nationalism in ways which exclude rather than include. And I think that's a change. And that is something which worries me.
And is this, I think your last chapter is he using this, whether nationalism or this, using religion rather as something to distract from his other failures is the question you leave us with actually. I know you have an answer also.
That is the question I leave the book with, leave the reader with, because it is true that all political parties, all regimes have used some ideology or other to ensure their dominance. It is true that we are an unequal society in which, while poverty has come down, inequality still remains very high, and large sections of the population that are unemployed, that are economically distressed. So the question I end with is, how much of this so-called nationalism is really about pride in a country, and how much of it is a diversion away from the real problems of economic development, of employment, of malnutrition, of poverty, the real problems of the people of India. Are we diverting their attention away by talking only about Hindu nationalism, building temples? This agenda, is it a diversion, or is it some kind of a coming to fruition of some long pending historical process?
And also, is there an answer? How do we? Who's going to call their bluff? Really, as you said, it's either the economy or a strong opposition. I think it's the failing economy that may just be the end.
That's for the future. That's for the future.
That's the next book. So then, what are the markers, say, of today's elite? If we just go into just the outward manifestations, I mean, which means one should just give up a Gymkhana Club membership and give up seminars, start reading Swarajya, become part of the India Foundation lectures. Though I don't know these days how much India Foundation is also.
Yeah, these are the new markers. I mean, relative balance keeps changing all the time, even within those institutions and those publications. But certainly, Hindi, Hindu are the two important identifying features. I keep teasing some of my friends from Andhra Pradesh and Telangana who are members of the RSS who insist on speaking in Hindi, and I speak to them in Telugu. And I say, why are you guys speaking Hindi? Just because you are the members of the RSS, why do you need to speak in Hindi? Why don't you speak to me in Telugu? But this is the thing. I mean, there are new markers of elitism. There are new markers of being in power. There was this famous slogan which used to be a sticker on cars in Delhi, at least I remember, "Garv se kaho, hum Hindu hain." So that sense of pride is there. I have no problem with that. I think it's there's nothing wrong in being proud of your own cultural and social inheritance. But I think the thing really is when you use that as a way of distinguishing, of excluding the other, and saying that it's like in the West where Trump said, if you're white, you're more American. And we are now beginning to say, if you're Hindu, you're more Indian. And that is something I worry about.
In fact, you talk about how Vajpayee was ideology, whatever, was an umbrella like Nehru's was. And here Modi's is majoritarianism, and it's also an exclusivist ideology, really.
I call it from 1991 to 2014 as a kind of a golden era of consensual politics. You had three prime ministers in that period: Narasimha Rao, Atal Bihari Vajpayee, and Manmohan Singh. All three of whom were consensus builders. They brought people together. I think Vajpayee was a very gracious prime minister. Though he was committed to the values of his party, he brought in all kinds of people under his leadership. And I think that is what united the country. So between Narasimha Rao, Vajpayee and Manmohan Singh, you had political leaders who were consensual in their politics and inclusive in their politics and strengthened the country, which is why I believe the economy actually did better in those 18 years or so. I mean, almost 25 years. But now we have a very divisive political leadership, and the language is divisive, the politics is divisive, and that worries me. And I don't think that's good for the country. I don't think it's good for the economy. And you do see the economy faltering. I don't think we can ignore these links between political stability, social harmony, and economic performance.
But the three examples you gave, if I let you go, were of prime ministers who ran coalition governments. So do you really feel that coalition governments are better for our country, despite contrary to what you say that they're not as stable?
No, in fact, they're all stable. I don't think I've said they're not stable. They're certainly all stable for governments. But the fact is that we are a coalition as a nation. And that is the difference between the new thinking about the country and the old thinking. That we saw ourselves as plural, as diverse, as multicultural, multi-ethnic. But today we are being told that basically Hindustan is about accepting Hindutva, and Muslims are Hindus and Christians are Hindus. I think that's a very, very limited way of looking at the history of our country. And strength of consensus or coalition politics is that it recognizes the diversity of the country.
That is a very fine last word to end this interview with. And all the best with your new book. And I'm sure we'll have a whole lot more conversations, because I can see a lot of roundtables that are going to be coming out of this. So I'm going to have you back on air with the panel.
Thank you,
but thank you for now.
Always a pleasure being with you. Thank you.
For more such videos, subscribe to the NewsX YouTube channel, hit the bell icon.